Hey YouTube, so there's just been this paper released which gave the PhilPapers survey to analytic philosophers in China. It's having a look at what do philosophers in China believe. Um, Now, of course, it goes without saying. I mean, these sorts of results are they're basically meaningless, right? Um, the any sort of differences here, it could just be because they're interpreting the questions differently. And in any case, the idea of reducing philosophical argument and analysis to just this, like, okay, just give them a questionnaire, right? Select which position you hold. It's not really telling. And obviously, like, look, with most of these positions, there's going to be multiple different forms of them. I mean, if I ask you, like, are you a Platonist or are you a nominalist? Different people can mean all sorts of different things by each of those positions. So, like, yes, obviously there's tons of reasons why there are problems with this sort of thing. But the thing is these surveys are fun. Okay, so that's the reason to do it, I think. Anyway, one of the things that was interesting about this is there were the views were much more mixed. There was less consensus. One of the authors suggest that the reason for this might be that in Chinese culture, there's more of a propensity to compromise and to be conciliatory, which I guess makes sense. I mean, it's a somewhat more collectivist culture, so there's sort of less. There's more pressure against adopting very unusual extreme views. I feel like it sort of makes sense. I think that in more individualist cultures, you'll tend to find people who just sort of accept the, like, radical extreme positions, or you want to adopt positions that distinguish you from the rest of everybody else. But I suppose there's going to be less pressure to do that in Chinese culture, or even pressure against doing that. So that might account for why you tend to find the philosophers in China accepting a combination of views, or just having sort of less extreme positions. It did occur to me as well that another reason for this might just be greater epistemic humility, right? I mean, maybe it's just that for whatever reason, philosophers in China are less willing to take a bet on positions that they're not quite so sure about. I remember when I filled out this survey. I mean, look, there's so many different questions that I'd kind of forgotten most of the debate about many of them. But I was just like, screw it. I mean, whatever I feel inclined towards, I'll just say that I accept that. Because otherwise I'm just going to be saying, like, I don't know for most of it, and that's boring, right? So I don't know, maybe for one reason or another, people in China are less inclined to do that sort of thing. But okay then. What were the big differences here? Well, one thing, I mean, there's this question on the aim of philosophy. I did notice, in the original survey, there was much more sort of cognitivism, as it were. I think in the original survey, about 55% of philosophers selected understanding, 42 selected truth or knowledge as the aim. We've only got 27% for understanding, about 15% for truth or knowledge here. But then, on the other hand, all the other options are much lower as well. So again, this could just be because philosophers in China are sort of less likely to commit to one particular position. Although you didn't have to commit to one particular position for this question. You could have accepted a range of them. I guess the results for eating animals and animal products is unsurprising. Omnivorism is far more popular over there than vegetarianism, than it is in the English-speaking survey. I can't remember the numbers, but I feel like, if I'm right, I think in the English-speaking survey, either vegetarianism or veganism was that had the sort of highest. I can't remember what it was. Well, in any case, again, I guess that's not so surprising. Oh yes, the experience machine. This was really interesting. I think this was the one I found the most interesting. Was that look at that, 47% of the Chinese philosophers selected to enter the experience machine. Um, I mean, it's not the majority, but that's way more than there was in the English speaking survey. In fact, I know that the number who selected no for the English speaking survey, I think it was around 70%. Um, so, and also, there's relatively few people in this question saying other or accepting a combination of views. Um, so this one I found interesting because the sort of impression that one gets is that Chinese culture is more collectivist, and in fact, the authors point out that's something which maybe accounts for some of the other responses given on this survey. But when it comes to something like the experience machine, I would have thought that collectivist attitudes would kind of they'd sort of put pressure against that, because if you're talking about the experience machine, it's like, okay, you just get in this machine and it's great for you, but one of the things that you're going to be doing is, I mean, giving up like any of your connections to other people. You're going to be maybe no longer fulfilling your obligations to others. Now, of course, I know that if you're taking the experience machine thought experiment as it's supposed to be taken, then you sort of have to put that to one side, right? So the question of your obligations to others gets put to one side. You're like, look, don't consider that. So maybe, maybe that's... But I think the thing is that's the sort of thing where it's like, it's going to influence your, like, intuitions and gut reactions regardless of, you can sort of say, okay, right, you just have to ignore other people, but it's very hard. It's like, it's hard for that to not have an influence on what your intuitions and feelings are, even if it's like intellectually, it's not relevant. So like maybe the Chinese philosophers are just really good at putting that to one side and like following the argument wherever it leads. But even so, I thought it was kind of interesting. I did wonder if maybe it was because I feel like in sort of East Asian philosophy in general, there's more sympathy with more sort of skeptical positions. There's more sympathy with the idea that, like, well, this is already kind of a dream world. And so the idea of then getting into the experience machine, it's like the whole point of the experience machine, at least for Nozick, was like people value a connection to reality, right? But if you're already part of a tradition where, like, you're already kind of very sympathetic to the idea that, oh yeah, well, this this is reality, like, no, then getting into the experience machine, you're not really going to see that as so much of a loss. That's what I would have thought. But then I looked at the next question, which was the question on the external world, and you can see that skepticism, is only at 10% here, non-skeptical realism at 61.4%, which is slightly less than it was for the English-speaking survey. I think there is slightly more skepticism here, slightly less non-skeptical realism, but still, the vast majority are still non-skeptical realists. So, yeah, I don't know. The experience machine one is an interesting one, and if I recall reading the paper, I don't think the authors gave a suggestion about why that might be. So I thought that was interesting. Oh, another one that's interesting is the footbridge one. Of course, this is the trolley problem, right? And this was a big divergence from... Oh, no, not the footbridge. That's the wrong one. So the footbridge one is where you have it's the version of the trolley problem where there's, the dude on the bridge and the trolley's coming down. You have to push him off the bridge to stop the trolley and stop it from killing 5 other people. Okay, yeah, so this was no surprise at all. 66% say don't push, 5.6% say push. Although, what is surprising about this is the number of people selecting other. I guess that would just be people who aren't familiar with it. But I mean, it's interesting that there's such a high proportion of people who are not familiar with it, just because, this is like the trolley problem it's at least in, Western philosophy, it's like it's such a big part of ethics. You kind of can't avoid hearing about this and hearing about lots of variations of it. Although I guess actually maybe the people selecting other, this question is obviously open to some interpretation, because you could interpret it as asking like just what would you do, and then you could also interpret it as asking what ought you do. I think that really so I think really what it's asking is what ought you do, and maybe if you're like a moral error theorist or something, you'll just say, well, like yeah, you might just say neither. Maybe you just say there's no obligation either way. So yeah, maybe that accounts for that. Yeah, okay then. So, was there anything else here? I mean, yeah, as I mentioned, with a lot of these, it's the you get the same sort of. So the majority position in the English-speaking case is the same as the majority position in the Chinese-speaking case. It's just that it's there's fewer people in the Chinese-speaking case. There's a smaller majority. So similarly, like classical logic beats non-classical logic, but look, it's only 28% for classical logic. Much more subjectivism about the meaning of life. Oh, and I think aesthetic value also had a much more subjectivism. So more the suggestion, interestingly, for aesthetic value, the authors made the point that it maybe part of the reason why there were fewer Chinese philosophers accepting objectivism about aesthetic value is because in Chinese aesthetic traditions there is far less emphasis on things like beauty. So in Western art, that's always been like a really significant part of our artistic tradition. Is like this aim for beauty, for capturing beauty, and judgments of beauty are the sorts of thing like they're the sorts of aesthetic judgments that I guess seem much more like if you're going to make a case for aesthetic realism, I guess the place you would make it is in judgments of beauty, right? Like people, there's even David Hume has this thing. Oh, I can't remember the exact statement. So even Hume, he says something like, you'd have to be mad to think that. What was it? To say that Milton is of just as much value as to say that a Milton is of just as much value as an Ogilvy, where Ogilvy was somebody who was not very well regarded in Hume's time. That would be as mad as saying that a mountain is as high as a molehill. But anyway, I think if it seems like judgments of beauty, I suppose, are the sorts of things that people can be right or wrong about. And we tend to be very much inclined to say things like, well, I can see that, this is a very beautiful piece, but I personally don't like it. That kind of statement is sort of common enough, and I suppose maybe that suggests a more objectivist approach. Maybe. I mean, look, to be clear, I'm not remotely objectivist about aesthetic value, but anyway, this was the idea. But yeah, also meaning of life, more subjectivism there. When it came to metaethics, though, moral realism still winning, 52% to 23% anti-realist. So yeah, I guess the subjectivism doesn't extend quite so far. Okay, so it was the trolley problem. Yeah, the trolley problem was the one that I found particularly interesting. So this is the standard version, the original version of the trolley problem, where you've got 5 people tied to one track. The trolley is coming towards them. You can pull the lever to switch and make the trolley kill just one person rather than 5. And look, you've got 33% saying don't switch, 28% selecting switch, which is very different to the original survey. In the original survey, the majority of people selected switch. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was very heavily weighted in favour of switch. And I thought this was interesting because my guess would have been, as somebody who is really not very familiar with China at all, my guess would have been it was like, well, it's more collectivist, right? It would make sense in that context that like maybe they would be more inclined to like sacrifice one person to save many. Like, isn't that sort of like I mean, if if you are in a culture where like the emphasis is more on, the group, right, it's not going to be such a big deal that you have to like violate individual rights. I mean, usually the reason why people would say that you ought not to switch in the case of the trolley problem is they'd be coming at it from like a kind of Kantian deontological point of view, where like you ought not to use people as a means to ends, as a means to the end of somebody else, right? And from that point of view, it's like, okay, so you can't switch, you can't kill this person, to use that person use the person's death as a means of saving the lives of these other people, and so that kind of reasoning is going to be less prevalent, one would have thought, in a very collectivist culture. What the authors suggest, though, is that, well, collectivist cultures value they value like social reputation much more. So there's going to be much more emphasis on like you avoid actions that might elicit negative social evaluations. So like your reputation matters more. So you want to avoid doing things that might make people judge you. And so in general, then that's going to incline people more to just like not get involved, to just not act. And that also connects up with in Chinese cultures, there's when you look at their sort of kind of religious and spiritual beliefs, it tends to be things like Taoism and things like that, and these are frameworks which tend to emphasize like inaction and just passivity and sort of letting things go, like let nature take its own course. So they tend to there's like pressure against performing actions that would like count as a kind of interference. So in the case of the trolley problem, you just don't interfere, let things take their own course. And also, they also mention that one of the features of collectivist cultures is that there's more emphasis on things like empathetic concern. So these sorts of, it's not just that there's a tendency to want to avoid negative social appraisals. Social emotions like guilt and so on are also they kind of have a stronger role in collectivist cultures. So again, that's just another thing where it's like, okay, you just don't do things that would elicit those sorts of emotions. And if of course you have like greater empathetic concern, then okay, on the one hand, you empathize with the 5 people who are threatened by the trolley, but also you're going to, empathize with the one person whose life is being sacrificed. And that sort of empathetic reasoning maybe cuts against the purely utilitarian calculation of like, okay, if I kill this one person, I save this 5. So that was the suggestion, which I thought was, so that was interesting. I mean, I have no idea whether that is. I mean, again, this is just a suggestion, right? I mean, really, I mean, as I said, these surveys, it's hard to know how seriously to take them anyway. But I thought that was interesting. A final point was the one on proper names. Fregeanism about proper names, much more popular here than millionism. It's the opposite in the original survey. So of course this is the sort of million view would be that the meaning of the proper name just is the object that it refers to, whereas like a Fregean view would say, well, no, the meaning of the proper name is something more like a description, like a proper name is like an abbreviated description. They made the point that proper names in China are already essentially abbreviated descriptions. So I think like Beijing, the Chinese for that is literally like North City. Like Bei, I think it's Bei translates to north and Jing translates to city, and apparently a lot of proper names work that way. So our proper names are just kind of like arbitrary labels, and so the sort of million position is maybe a bit more attractive. But in Chinese languages, proper names are mostly apparently abbreviated descriptions. So of course you're going to be more attracted to the Fregean view. There we go. I mean, interesting, right? Or maybe not, but I'm that's all I'm going to say about that one. I thought it was interesting. I will I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.